Welcome to the Nameless.
He said something in there already knew his name. I remembered the way he stood on my porch with his coat still on, one hand on the railing like he needed it to stay upright. He didn't look at me when he said it. He stared past my shoulder into the hallway behind me and shook his head once. Not angry, not afraid exactly, just decided. "I'm not going in," he said, softer than I expected. "I can't." That was the second time he refused, and by then I knew better than to argue. The air behind me felt heavier, like a room that had been sealed for years and cracked open all at once. Before any of that, my life had been normal, in the boring, predictable way I'd always liked. I rented a small house on the edge of town, the kind of place built fast in the late 80s with thin walls and a layout that didn't quite make sense. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a narrow hallway that funneled everything toward the living room.
I worked from home doing customer support, spent my evenings cooking simple meals and watching reruns. I wasn't superstitious. I didn't believe in signs or presences or anything like that. The house was cheap, quiet, and close to the grocery store. That was all I cared about. The first few weeks were fine. The neighbors waved but didn't pry. The house had its usual quirks, pipes knocking, the heater clicking on too loud, but nothing unusual. I unpacked slowly. Some boxes stayed sealed in the spare room because I didn't need what was in them yet. That room always felt a little colder, but I blamed the vent. I'd lived in worse places. Things started small enough that I didn't mark a date for them. A sound at night, like someone shifting their weight in the hallway. The faint smell of something old and dusty when I walked past the spare room, even though I hadn't opened it in days.
Once, I thought I heard my name whispered, but it came through the wall like a neighbor's TV, and I told myself my brain had filled in the gap. I was tired. Work had been stressful. It was easier to laugh it off. What unsettled me was how consistent it became. Every night, around the same time, there would be a soft knock somewhere inside the house. Not on the door, on the wall. 3 taps, evenly spaced. I checked the exterior. I checked for branches, loose siding, animals. There was nothing. When I stayed up late to catch it, it didn't happen. When I went to bed early, it woke me up. I remember thinking, more than once, that it felt like the house was waiting for me to notice. I didn't tell anyone at first. When I finally mentioned it to a coworker during a call, I made it sound like a joke. "Old houses, right?" He laughed and agreed. That should have been the end of it. Instead, the noises changed.
The taps became a dragging sound, slow and careful, like someone pulling their fingers along the wall to find a doorway in the dark. It always stopped when I stood up. The spare room door began to open on its own, just a crack. I'd close it before bed and find it open in the morning, the gap wide enough to show the edge of a cardboard box inside. Once I found the light on. I stood in the hallway staring at it, trying to decide if I was more embarrassed by the idea that I'd forgotten to turn it off, or scared by the possibility that I hadn't. I started sleeping with the TV on for the noise. It helped, but only a little. In the quiet moments between shows, I could hear breathing that didn't match my own. It wasn't loud, it was close. The first real incident happened on a Tuesday. I know that because the trash was out front and I remember thinking I'd forget to bring it back in. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard someone say my name clearly from the hallway. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was calm, almost conversational. I froze with the mug halfway to the counter, my hand shaking enough that I spilled hot water on myself and didn't feel it right away. I said hello. I don't know why. Habit, maybe? The word echoed down the hall and came back thinner, wrong. There was no answer.
I walked to the spare room and pushed the door open. Nothing had moved. The boxes were still stacked. The air felt stale, like it hadn't circulated in years, and it smelled faintly sweet in a way that made my stomach turn. I closed the door and leaned against it until my breathing slowed. After that, things accelerated. Objects would be in different places than I left them, but only slightly. A chair angled toward the hallway instead of the table. A picture frame turned face down. I started keeping a mental inventory of my house, and that alone made me feel unbalanced.
I caught myself apologizing out loud when I moved something late at night, like I didn't want to be rude. I stopped using the spare room entirely. The door stayed closed. The taps stopped, replaced by long stretches of silence that felt worse. In that silence, I began to feel watched, not from a corner or a doorway, but from everywhere at once, like the walls themselves were paying attention. I reached out to my aunt because she was the only person I knew who wouldn't laugh. She listened quietly and asked me questions I didn't want to answer, like if I'd been stressed before moving in or if I'd noticed changes in myself. I told her about the voice. I didn't tell her that sometimes when I woke up, my mouth tasted like dust and my jaw hurt like I'd been talking all night. She suggested I talk to a pastor she trusted. I hesitated. I wasn't religious. I didn't want someone coming into my house and telling me I was imagining things. But by then, I was sleeping in short bursts and flinching at every sound. I agreed. The first time he came by, it was midday. Sunlight filled the porch. He shook my hand and smiled, and for a moment I felt foolish. Inside, the house seemed normal. Too normal. He stood in the living room and asked me to explain what was happening. As I spoke, I watched his expression change. Not dramatically, but in small ways. He kept glancing toward the hallway. When I finished, he asked if he could walk through the house. He took 2 steps toward the hall and stopped. He tilted his head, listening. I waited for him to say something reassuring. Instead, he backed up. "Not today," he said. "I'll come back." I felt stupid again, standing there alone after he left, the house quiet and bright. That night, the spare room door opened wider than it ever had before. I didn't close it. I sat on my bed and stared at the dark rectangle of the doorway until my eyes burned.
The second visit happened a week later. I'd almost convinced myself not to do it, but the night before, I woke up standing in the hallway, barefoot, facing the spare room. I don't remember getting out of bed. I remember the feeling of the carpet under my feet and the certainty that if I took one more step, something would finish a sentence it had been starting for a long time. When he arrived, the air felt different, heavy like before a storm. He stood on the porch and asked me to step outside. That's when he said it, his voice low. Something inside already knew his name. He wouldn't enter, not again. I asked him what that meant. He didn't answer directly. He told me to leave the house for a few days, to stay with someone else. He said it like advice, not a command, but there was an urgency under it that made my chest tighten. Before he left, he looked at me carefully and asked if I'd been hearing thoughts that didn't feel like my own. I didn't answer.
That night, I packed a bag and went to a friend's place. I slept better there, but not well. I dreamed of the hallway stretching longer and longer, doors appearing where there hadn't been any before. When I returned 3 days later, the house smelled stale again. The spare room door was closed. I decided to move out. I told myself that was the rational choice. People broke leases all the time. Houses had histories. But something kept me there, just long enough to clean and box things up. On my last afternoon, I heard the taps again. 3, evenly spaced, from inside the spare room. I stood in the hallway and listened. My name followed, quiet and patient, not threatening, familiar. I realized then that whatever was there had been learning me, the way you learn a schedule or a habit.
The thought made me feel hollow. I never opened that door again. I left the key on the counter and walked out without looking back. The house sold a few months later.
Sometimes late at night, I still hear 3 taps coming from inside my own walls, and I find myself holding my breath, waiting for it to say my name the way it used to, like it was just checking to see if I was still listening.